December 7th, 1941. This is a day that will live in infamy because it was the day that the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the United States naval fleet set in Pearl Harbor. The tension was building up for a while since the world is at war, and this was the perfect spark that introduced the U.S. into the warfare. Pearl Harbor is located in Oahu, Hawaii. Oh yeah, party, surfing, and is the center of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. A-grade warships and many other supporting ships were stationed at port when the attack occurred. The bombing of Pearl Harbor took more than 2,500 lives and wounded another 1,000 as well, destroying many ships and planes. The story of this event encompasses much more than just the bombing. It shows all the events that led up to it and ends with the declaration of war on Japan. The beginning of the event goes back to the U.S. wanting to join the war. The problem was the nation's people didn't approve. People wanted peace and didn't want to get involved. The story begins with why Japan did what they did. Articles did this to provide context to the reader because each story needs to have a background. As mentioned by Higgs in his article, he describes how Roosevelt put sanctions on Japan to lessen their industrialization and aligned himself with Chinese and British. As you can imagine, the Japanese were not grateful because they live on a little puny island that doesn't have much resources. They just lost trade with a nation they heavily relied on. It's like being stranded on an island with just a coconut. Not fun, and you definitely need more for survival. Anyways, this led to a plan on how to attack the U.S. because of their actions and because of the threat the U.S. brought to them, since they were expecting them to join the war aligning with the Allies. This was all characterized as the exposition. The rising action was when the Japanese began planning the attack and finally got as close as they could without being detected, and sent out 2 waves of fighter jets. It was planned through perfectly since they are Asians and, super smart. Commander Mitsu Fuchida was a Japanese commander who explained the story in his point of view of how they circled multiple times to be able to hit the target, and how he saw their command of the air unchallenged. This shows the superiority the Japanese felt and helps portray them as better villains because of their cockiness. This was the first time Americans were looking up at the Japanese, since Japanese are usually super short. Just kidding. Anyways, back to the batter. Bombs were dropped and the naval fleet was burning, which is the climax of the story. The following action is getting the ships repaired and helping the soldiers. The story ends with a resolution, which was to declare war on Japan and get involved in World War II. To turn this into a story, every article had protagonists and antagonists. Without them, there would be no plotline. Well, people say it's obvious that the U.S. is the protagonist and Japan the antagonist. That isn't entirely incorrect, but it could be much more accurate. The protagonists of the story are the U.S. soldiers. One well-known hero described by Kelly in her article is Dory Miller. Kelly discussed how African Americans didn't have combat roles back then, and how Miller was just a regular chef. He turned into a hero when the bombing began, and he started getting people to safety. And he picked up a Browning anti-aircraft machine gun, on which he had never been trained, and managed to shoot down 3 to 4 enemy aircraft. He was a great hero because he stepped up in the time of need and made a leap in equality for men, since he proved he was able to carry out combat warfare as an African American. Another such hero was described in the Los Angeles Times. His name was Kenneth M. Taylor, who was able to get a plane airborne and shoot down 6 planes. I was in a bit least terrified, Taylor told NBC News, and let me tell you why. I was too young and too stupid to realize that I was in a lot of danger. He was a real hero since he was selfless and didn't even think about the consequences, but went out and did what he could. There were also many unrecognized heroes. As a soldier of a ship explains how his major's strength gave out and I saw he was floundering, so I loosened my grip on him and told him to make it alone. He stopped and grabbed me by the shirt and refused to go. All the American soldiers were true heroes, dead or alive, because of their selflessness and willing to fight for their country and peers. Moving on to the antagonists, Japanese all were since they bombed the U.S. unexpectedly and for what seemed as no reason. Pearl Harbor Tours tries to explain the attack by saying that they believed the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was their only threat and set out to neutralize the fleet by means of a surprise air attack. This was unjustified, so nowadays, whenever something happens to Japan, people always say, it's karma for Pearl Harbor. They use it to justify Nagasaki, Hiroshima, say it's karma for the tsunami that happened a few years ago, but those are all different stories. Another surprising antagonist that was represented in many articles was FDR and the government. FDR is Franklin D. Roosevelt, if you guys don't know. Anyways, this came as a shock because FDR was the president, and he usually isn't seen as a bad guy. And also, how is the president of the country that is the victim an antagonist? Well, in the Telegraph, it is written that now, on the 17th century of Japan's devastating bombardment of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii evidence has emerged showing that President Roosevelt was warned 3 days before the attack that the Japanese Empire was eyeing up Hawaii with a view to open conflict. The information contained in a declassified memorandum from the Office of Naval Intelligence adds to proof that Washington dismissed red flags signaling that mass bloodshed was looming and war was imminent. Did Franklin Roosevelt really know? People will never know, but there are clear signs that he did. In the History News Network, it was written that all the U.S. carriers were safely elsewhere on December 7th. The authors just pointed to the facts that Roosevelt knew and decided to protect the most valuable ships. Roosevelt and the government needed an excuse to go into war, and this was the perfect opportunity. Roosevelt, in his speech the following day, said, "Japan has therefore undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and will understand the implications to the very life and safety to our nation." This was his excuse to go into war, and the people agreed because they were attacked. While telling the story, the authors of these articles made their own protagonists and antagonists in order to justify the event. It helped people process what has happened because there was someone to blame. Blame ties people together and gives them a mutual feeling. Protagonists tell people who to cheer for, while the antagonists point to who to hate. Including bad guys and good guys explains what must be done, gives people a path, lets them interpret. It makes them work together. It shows who was at fault. The story of Pearl Harbor will always be remembered with everyone in it classified as good or evil. Oh, and side note, there's no need to worry about surprise attacks anymore since we have nukes. Anyways.